You're listening to the Diplomats podcast on Asian geopolitics. As always, I'm your host, Ankit Panda from New York City, and I'm joined today by a familiar voice on the podcast, by someone who hasn't joined the show for a while. I'm happy to welcome Katie Putz, the managing editor of The Diplomat. Thanks for joining me, Katie.
Thank you very much for having me on.
Absolutely. And what a week to have you on, because there is a lot going on in Central Asia. And for better or worse, sadly, one of the stories does involve a terror attack in Tajikistan that I want to talk to you about today. But for better or worse, we really should be devoting more attention to Central Asia. And now I think, there are a couple topics that we have talked about before. I think last time we had you on, we talked about reform in Uzbekistan, which is something that you've been writing about a lot at the Crossroads Asia channel for The Diplomat. But today I want to talk to you about Tajikistan with the new Islamic State claimed attack there. Maybe we can probe a bit. Certainly the government's had an interesting reaction. We can talk a bit about that. And then the second story that I want to talk about that I think is also geopolitically quite significant is the resolution of a trial in Kazakhstan involving a Chinese citizen of Kazakh ethnicity. So we'll get to that in the second part of the discussion, but looking forward to chatting with you today, Katie.
Me too. I think there's been a lot going on in Central Asia this week, and a lot of it ties into larger, as you said, geopolitical currents. So there's definitely a lot to discuss.
Mm-hmm. Right. So let's start with Tajikistan. So on July 30th, the Islamic State's news agency Amaq officially claimed responsibility for a vehicular attack that ended up killing 4 foreign tourists who were biking around in the countryside. And the Tajik government, in the meantime, has chosen really to ignore that. And as far as I know, they're blaming it on the, surprise, the Islamic Renaissance Party of Tajikistan, the IRPT, which is an opposition party that's banned in the country. So, Katie, I guess let's start first with the Islamic State claim on the attack. So I know you covered this attack like pretty much as soon as it broke. So were you surprised when it was claimed by the Islamic State?
I wasn't necessarily surprised. I'm far from somebody who jumps to conclusions early, but fairly soon after the attack, the initial report said this was a road accident, which anybody who's ever been in Central Asia would probably agree is very reasonable because there are lots of road accidents. Mm-hmm. But it became evident fairly quickly that this was deliberate. RFERL acquired footage purportedly showing the attack that showed the car running into the cyclists and then turning around to run over them again. So it was very clear that it was deliberate. And then you kind of move on to, well, if this was deliberate, then why? And there are a range of reasonable possible theories to the crime, essentially. But I think Islamic State certainly popped up quickly. In 2017, there was a whole slew of very, very similar truck and car attacks. There was one in Ohio, there was one in Berlin, there was one in Stockholm, there was one in New York. There was one in Barcelona. There was a number of vehicular attacks of this kind. And it rooted back to an Islamic State publication that essentially said this is a very good way to go and attack Westerners because right. cars are ubiquitous, right? There's nothing strange about somebody driving a car down the street.
Right.
And so the tactic itself looked very similar to an entire trend. So when the Islamic State comes out and claimed it added another sort of notch in the column of, okay, this very possibly could be the Islamic State inspired or directed. And then the next day, the Islamic State released a video purporting to show the five gentlemen involved in this attack, pledging allegiance to ISIS in front of a black flag. The men in the video resembled men that the Tajik government said were responsible for this attack. They had published photos of these people.
Right.
And so the notches in the Islamic State column were adding up. And so I think that's a reasonable sort of conclusion. What that doesn't tell us is whether this was inspired or directed. If you look at some of the other vehicular attacks, particularly the one in New York and Stockholm, which were both Central Asians also, those are sort of self-radicalized online. There wasn't somebody back in ISIS headquarters directing these. These were inspired by Islamic State propaganda. And in my opinion, that seems to be what happened here.
Right. I think that's pretty likely. And that's the Islamic State's model. They make it very easy to become a franchisee, so to speak. And
Yeah.
pledge your allegiance remotely and become a quote unquote soldier of the caliphate, which I think is what Amak referred to these guys
Yes.
as.
Yes.
So yeah, so I think I'm right there with you. I think Islamic State does seem to be the perpetrator. But Katie, let's talk a bit about the government's reaction, which I know you have a few thoughts on.
Yeah.
So why are they blaming the Islamic Renaissance Party?
Yeah. So, I think it was around Wednesday after the Islamic State had released this video. So, sort of the Islamic State's making their case that we did this. The Tajik government had on Monday had said they were considering all of the options, but I really think they had kind of made up their mind. And they said that the IRPT, with training provided by Iran, had planned this. And if you look back at sort of the political situation in Tajikistan, some of our listeners probably don't know the nuances of Tajik politics, which is perfectly fine. The IRPT was a parliamentary party from the late 90s through 2015. In 2015, it lost the 2 seats it had in parliament. Footnote, no election in Tajikistan has been judged free or fair, so it's unclear whether they lost those 2 seats because they didn't have support or because the government finally wanted to fully get rid of its opposition. And then by the end of the year, the party had been banned. Most of its leaders had been arrested or had fled into exile, mostly in Europe. And they were labeled a terrorist organization. As far as I know, no other country has labeled them as a terrorist organization. The leader of the party gained asylum in a European country. A number of the other party leaders are spread mostly throughout Europe with asylum. The Tajik government put a whole bunch of people up on Interpol's red notice list, and most of them have been taken off as they started analyzing the sources of these claims. The IRPT has never been linked to an actual extremist attack. When it was a political party, it was in opposition to the government, but it's never advocated the violent overthrow of the government. It's fallen very much into a democratic camp. And so I think for the Tajik government, the IRPT has long been its boogeyman. Back in the Civil War days, the IRPT was a part of the opposition. And so that, in sort of a continuation of the struggles from that era, trying to get rid of any possible source of opposition to the government's power, and the IRPT is the perfect sort of target, in particular because of in Western discourse, our sort of discomfort in Islamism and Islamic politics. It kind of feeds itself to kind of saying, hey, these guys they're Islamists, they're bad, they're definitely behind this.
Mm-hmm.
And without sort of critical evaluation of whether there's the capability or the motivation, certainly nothing the party has ever said publicly supports this kind of thing. The party immediately denounced this attack, said these guys were not members, and I think the Tajik government said this, maybe hoping nobody would notice. I have no idea why they thought that people are going to get away with this claim. I do want to point out the Tajik government hasn't said that it wasn't the Islamic State, but has overwhelmingly put forward that it's the IRPT. So certainly at some point they might make the argument the IRPT and ISIS are in cahoots with each other,
right.
which makes no sense if they also say the IRPT is in cahoots with Iran, because that would mean that Iran and ISIS are working together, which also makes no sense.
Yeah, I was going to actually ask you about the Iran claim. So what is kind of the geopolitical reason behind throwing kind of Iran in there as the guys who are training these supposed IRPT militants?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting kind of multifaceted answer to that question. So Tajikistan and Iran share a lot of sort of cultural heritage. The Tajik language is a derivative of Persian. There's a lot of sort of shared history. So they had long been allies, despite a religious difference. Most Muslims in Tajikistan are Sunni. Iran is a Shia state. Despite that, they got along just fine for the longest time. But Tajikistan has kind of fallen into the larger conflagration between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia has kind of moved in and is providing a lot of aid to Tajikistan. And Iran, on the other hand, the year that the IRPT was being shunted out of Tajikistan, I think it was in December, they hosted a large Islamic conference, and sat the IRPT representatives who had been labeled as terrorists by the Tajik government next to the official Tajik delegation. And so that really, really ticked off Dushanbe. And so since then, there's been a very serious sort of tension between Iran and Tajikistan, fed in a large part by Saudi Arabia, essentially moving into what was an Iranian ally.
Okay.
And so because Iran essentially refused to go along with labeling the IRPT a terrorist group, has hosted its leader, is kind of like the rest of the world has not accepted the fact that the IRPT are extremists, because they certainly don't seem to be, and not in the conversations I've had with their spokesman and with members. But it's certainly the Iran-Tajikistan relationship has fallen victim to the larger Iran-Saudi Arabia contest for power and influence across the sort of larger Muslim world, I would say.
Got it. Well, that's really interesting. We should really dig into that maybe another time and talk a bit more about that. I'm actually writing I've been spending the last year actually working on a paper for USIP about Pakistan's role in that sort of struggle, and there are actually some interesting links to Afghanistan and Central Asia that I think make this bigger picture, I think, something worth highlighting. You don't really read a lot about this, but it's, I think, quite interesting.
Yeah, it's definitely kind of a niche topic, and you don't necessarily notice it unless you're following like who's funding the building of large mosques and things like that.
Yeah. Last question before we move on to Kazakhstan. So, we know that in Afghanistan, obviously, the Islamic State has been quite active in the northern provinces that borders Tajikistan, Badakhshan. It was just one example. Do you see that do you see this attack having anything to do with kind of ongoing dynamics with the Islamic State in Afghanistan, or is this sort of a separate beast?
I think right now we have to say it's a separate beast. And unfortunately, I'm not certain we're ever going to really find out, because the Tajik government seems to want to follow this IRPT notion. I think it's not seriously considering the Islamic State connection and asking the serious questions of how were these guys radicalized? Were they given instructions? If so, from whom? So it's sort of, if the inspiration for this came from your general sort of online radicalization, amorphous osmosis of terrorist ideology, then that's one thing. But if this came from across the border, that's another issue.
Right.
And I have absolutely no way of knowing that without serious investigation by the Tajik authorities. But I just don't see them doing that. I haven't seen anything that establishes a link between this attack and anything happening in Afghanistan. But I don't know. And unfortunately, I don't know that we're going to find that out.
Okay. Well, I think just highlighting that uncertainty is also definitely worthwhile as a point of analysis. Well, okay, I think we'll wrap up the Tajikistan discussion there. But I want to talk to you now about developments between Kazakhstan and China. So you'd been reporting in some detail at the Diplomat on the trial of Sayragul Sauytbay, an ethnic Kazakh Chinese citizen who was charged with illegally crossing the border to see family in Kazakhstan. And this trial was dramatic, and you said at Diplomat that the result was basically a pleasant surprise. So I'm guessing most of our listeners, again, maybe didn't follow this trial. So can you just tell us a bit about the circumstances of the case and what was really at stake here?
Yeah, definitely. First, just a little bit of deeper background. So the Kazakh people of old were nomads. So when modern country borders began being drawn across Eurasia, some Kazakhs ended up in what is now China's Xinjiang. There's a Kazakh autonomous prefecture within Xinjiang. And when Kazakhstan became independent, its titular ethnicity was not the majority ethnicity in the state. That was Russians at the time of independence. As Russians outmigrated, Kazakhstan essentially invited its diaspora to return, made it relatively easy for them to get Kazakh citizenship. So there are thousands of families sort of split across the Chinese-Kazakh border. Ethnic Kazakh Chinese citizens in Xinjiang, their children moved to Kazakhstan to work jobs, became Kazakh citizens. They go back, visit their grandparents in China. And this wasn't really a problem until relatively recently.
Right.
There was a change in leadership in Xinjiang, and in a very concerted effort to I guess the Chinese would probably say politically educate the Muslims of Xinjiang about the Chinese state. Most of us would say these are essentially re-education or internment camps that have been set up, mostly Uyghurs who have been sent to them, but there have been a good number of ethnic Kazakhs who have also been packaged up to these camps. And so that brings us to Sayragul Sauytbay. And she is an ethnic Kazakh Chinese citizen. She'd been working in Xinjiang as a kindergarten teacher, and I read some of the reports cited that she was even a Communist Party member. Her husband and her two children had been living in Kazakhstan for 2 years, and they had obtained Kazakh citizenship last year. In early 2018, Sauytbay was transferred to teaching at one of the political re-education camps.
Right.
And her passport was confiscated. The Chinese authorities tried to persuade her to get her to family to return. And so in April, she illegally crossed the border into Kazakhstan, and in May, she was arrested by Kazakh authorities. The Chinese wanted her deported back to China. The trial really became such a huge event in large part because she was speaking in open court about these camps, which the Chinese government has denied the existence of.
Right.
And so, when she's sitting in court and saying, they call them political re-education camps, but they're actually prison camps in the mountain filled with, over 2,000 Kazakhs at 3 separate camps. Then there were gasps in the court reportedly to that. This became a much larger issue. And so, interestingly, her lawyers nobody tried to contest the fact of the crime. She crossed the border illegally. What they did say was that if you send her back, she will disappear. She's essentially spouting what Beijing considers state secrets in an open courtroom. You can't send her back. And so the trial ended this week, and she was released on a suspended sentence, no threat of deportation. The judge even said in her sort of sentencing that the crime of crossing the border illegally couldn't really be considered serious because it was the only way for her to reunite with her family.
Right.
And so this was like a remarkable, the Kazakh justice system does not always deliver a humanitarian outcome. And this really was a good outcome for this case.
Mm-hmm. So does she get citizenship in Kazakhstan now?
I haven't seen that as an automatic thing, but I would not be surprised if in a year or two, what the ruling was for a 6-month suspended sentence. So she was released from jail and essentially told to check in with the police on occasion. So I think they'll essentially keep tabs on her, but she can go live with her family. I would anticipate her becoming a Kazakh citizen at some point. Certainly her remarks after the verdict was read out and she walked out of the courtroom were about, how wonderful Kazakhstan is and how nice it is to be among her people. So I can't see the Kazakhs not giving her citizenship at some point, to be honest.
Mm-hmm. Well, so the geopolitics of all this seem rather complicated because the Kazakh government did have to broach China about this uncomfortable topic that China certainly doesn't want to talk about. And the Chinese reaction, as far as I can tell, has been muted, effectively silent, not really addressing this. So I hope that, this happy ending sticks. But, then I wonder if there are sort of now back channel efforts in China to try to win deportation or extradition or something like that. Obviously, that'd be dramatic, but, it could cause a major bilateral issue. I mean, based on the reporting that you've done, it doesn't seem like that's happening, and the Kazakhs have been actually quite successful in approaching China about this. But is that going to hold?
Yeah, so on the larger issue of the camps in Xinjiang, the Kazakh government has been fairly successful in quietly lobbying for Kazakh citizens who were accidentally detained in these camps to be returned and let go. But Astana has done this very quietly through diplomatic channels and has not made large public statements about what they would probably call internal matters in China. That said, there's a considerable undercurrent of anti-Chinese sentiment in Kazakhstan, and it comes with a lot of the development issues and a lot of other things. But it doesn't extend to the government's policies in terms of economic policies and political relations. But I think it does impact how they manage various issues because Astana realizes that this anti-Chinese sentiment can really spark trouble. And we saw that in 2016. there were nationwide protests because there were rumors that changes to the land code would allow Chinese to buy up large swaths of Kazakh land. And so you saw large protests in 2016 sparked by an anti-Chinese rumor. It's very reasonable for Astana to have looked at this case and said, well, if this goes badly, we could have a serious problem. Kazakhs were watching this case. The court was open. People were reporting on this. There were live blogs. This was a very intensely watched case. And so if it had gone the other way, right. Kazakhstan could have had, I would have expected demonstrations. Right. I don't think they would have been super huge just because of the security concerns, like personal security concerns that go with demonstrating in Kazakhstan. But I think there would have been public outcry that Kazakhstan had chosen China over the Kazakhs. And so when you look at this particular case from that 30,000-foot view, you start to see some of the rough edges between Central Asia and China. I don't anticipate her being deported at a later time to China. I think that would engender a huge backlash.
Yeah.
I'm curious to see how the Chinese retaliate for this or respond to this. They certainly could write this off as essentially a necessity on the Kazakh state's part for its own security, but I don't know if the Chinese will be that generous about it. So we'll see how this. I haven't seen any response. I would think we talked before the podcast. The Chinese have not really commented on this, and probably won't, with the idea that if you don't talk about it, it will go away. Mm-hmm. But it certainly has a lot to say about the Kazakh-Chinese relationship and that sort of thing.
Right. And I think, this is a transnational issue because of the various ethnic groups, apart from Uyghurs, that are getting caught up in the re-education camp, Dragnet and Xinjiang. One other thing I'll just say about this is that this, you're absolutely right that the open discussion of the practices in these camps in a Kazakh court was quite interesting. And it's actually been interesting to me how, relatively speaking, in the West, this has not really gotten major pickup. I think the Financial Times did a good report on it, a few other places, but I haven't really seen sort of top-level coverage from a lot of the major Western newspapers who have been otherwise paying attention increasingly over the last year to the issue of the crackdown in Xinjiang and the re-education camps. So that'll be interesting to see if this actually does end up snowballing and sort of sparking more scrutiny of the practices that China's employing there.
I think one thing to watch is whether this is repeated, because as I said earlier, there are thousands of families split over the Chinese-Kazakhstan border. And so this is likely not the only case of a family in Kazakhstan that has a relative in China who has disappeared, likely into one of these camps. And so does this case set a precedent that if you can make it to Kazakhstan, you can stay? Or because in the past, Kazakhstan has been perfectly fine with deporting Uyghurs that China wanted returned. Really, no questions asked. All of Central Asia has been fairly comfortable with sending back Uyghurs. But when it comes to their own ethnic groups, in Kazakhstan's case, in this particular instance, they've clearly gone the other way. And so I would be curious to see if this gets repeated, because I can't believe that she is the only person in this situation.
Right. Absolutely. Well, Katie, thank you so much for that context on really both those topics today.
Oh, thank you very much for having me on. I love going on about Central Asia.
Yeah, absolutely. No, and we really don't do Central Asia as much as we should on the Asia Geopolitics podcast, and it's been a really big push for us at Diplomat over the past 3 years, so hoping to have you on more frequently to talk about other topics in the region. But before we end, do you want to tell our listeners about the latest issue of the magazine that just went out a few days ago?
Yes. So the 45th issue of the Diplomat magazine just hit digital newsstands. Our cover story is by Aidan Foster Carter, who is just a wonderful analyst, great guy, focusing on North Korea and North Korean diplomacy from the North Korean perspective. A lot of what we see analyzing sort of the international politics of the North Korea issue, but not what is the motivation for North Korea to essentially make this titanic shift from absolute bellicosity to diplomatic engagement. And then we have a number of other exciting pieces. One on Taiwanese military power and sort of how well would Taiwan be able to defend itself against the Chinese attack. We've got an article about Narendra Modi and the BJP looking towards India's elections next year and whether Modi can kind of keep winning. And then finally, an article that I really, really love because I also edit our Oceania section that sort of shines light on Pacific Island diplomacy. The Pacific Islands have the same problem as Central Asia sometimes, where we only talk about them in context of larger powers. We never really talk about their internal politics with each other. And so this focuses on sort of intra-Pacific Island diplomacy.
Well, terrific. I'm sure our listeners will be intrigued to peruse this issue. And you should really subscribe to the magazine if you haven't already. There's a lot more great content there that you won't find on the website.
Good stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And I will also remind listeners, since this is a new thing, that I've started writing a newsletter. And certainly I did actually discuss some of Katie's earlier reporting on the Kazakh trial in the newsletter. So if you want a sense of some of the geopolitical topics that you should be paying attention to in non-podcast form in your email inbox, definitely do try to subscribe. You can get to that at diplomat.substack.com is where you can subscribe to that newsletter. Anyways, thanks a lot for listening to the podcast. And if you haven't subscribed yet on iTunes or Google Play, please do so. And if you have subscribed but you haven't left us a review, please do that as well. As far as I know, we're just about over 100 reviews on iTunes. If you want to help us get over that hump, that would be really cool. So thanks a lot for listening, and I'll be back next week with more.